Greetings, humans of the internet, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as usual, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historic insights. And since last week's episode was about the history of streetcars and trolleys in the United States, I figured it would be a good time to discuss the descendant of trolleys, and that, of course, is bus lines. No, those, of course, are bus lines, I think, would probably be the better way of saying that. Yes, of course, yeah. Sorry for the grammatical error. And so the next stop is the history of buses and bus lines in the United States. And away we go! And yes, that was a Jackie Gleason Honeymooners reference, so yeah, there's that. Anyway, back to the history. Now, as we learned last week, the predecessor of all modern public transit, of course, is the omnibus, which was invented in 1826. However, an earlier experiment, which proved to be not very successful, happened in 1662 in Paris. And the first person to propose the idea of a public transportation system was a man named Blaise Pascal, who launched a handful of horse-drawn carriage routes in Paris, France in 1662. They were called five-penny coaches. The carriages were initially a hit, but it only took about 10 years for the hype to completely die down. And since they were only available to nobles and the gentry, many quote-unquote commoners didn't even get the chance to see if they liked the service. And so the first public transportation system was a flop. And as we discussed earlier, the first successful public transportation system was the omnibus. These, of course, were horse-drawn passenger wagons that were pulled by 1 to 3 horses, depending on their size. Interestingly, we did not discuss this last week, the largest models held up to 42 passengers, and some even featured 2 stories with an open top. However, and this is not a subject I believe I discussed last week, the omnibuses were very uncomfortable. Roads at the time were paved with cobblestones, so as you can imagine, the rides were anything but comfortable. Also, another problem was high fare price, estimated to be 12 cents one way. With time, though, the system found a middle-class audience who couldn't afford private stagecoaches but were willing to pay to avoid walking. The audience helped the omnibus stick around long enough to start seeing some improvements. Rapid urbanization also saw an increase in public transportation, as we talked about before. Urban development and better city planning resulted from accommodation of bus routes. These developments became some of the precursors to the Industrial Revolution, and as a result of these efforts, 20,000 horse-drawn buses were added throughout the U.S. and over 30,000 miles of railroad tracks were laid. However, even with these improvements, the early bus systems still brought problems of their own. For one thing, traffic jams, contrary to popular belief, are definitely not a modern phenomenon. Road traffic wasn't relegated during the early days when employees began traveling to work from home, and the increased number of people and vehicles on the streets resulted in many traffic jams. And I'm sure I don't need to mention the other problem that horses brought along: manure buildup. The amount of manure left became a public health concern, and in 1872, an influenza outbreak caused the death of thousands of horses, which halted the operation of many horse-drawn omnibus operators. And as discussed earlier, 1881 saw another big development in the history of public transportation when the electric streetcar was invented. And this also gives me a chance to discuss something I did not discuss before, and that is how these electric trolleys work. Electric current was carried to the cars through an arm-like extension, and the metal wheels and metal tracks acted as grounding for the electrical circuit so the passengers would not be electrocuted by the car. And this began a new era of city planning, where walkability was no longer a key feature and residential developments and downtown shopping centers overlapped less frequently. The invention of the streetcar gave way to the sprawling, bustling metropolises we know today, dense commercial areas in the city with less dense residential zones surrounding the city. The end of the 1800s also brought with it a new appeal for a rapid transit system. Even though streetcars provided a good way to get in and out of a city, they were still victim to some traffic limitations. And so heavy rail transit systems, as opposed to light rail streetcar systems, started to spring up in major U.S. cities. Heavy rail would carry trains across long distances without crossing traffic. The first city to do so was Chicago, Illinois, with the opening of the L train, which sits elevated above city streets and still runs runs to this day. Boston, Massachusetts followed shortly after in 1897 with the United States' first subway system, which could run freely without the influence of Boston's harsh winter blizzard conditions and narrow winding streets. During the 1890s, we saw the origins of the bus line. The first motorized bus was developed in 1895 by Carl Benz of Mercedes-Benz fame. It could seat 8 people, and it was driven by a 4-horsepower single-cylinder engine. Early buses in the United States were operated by sightseeing companies in New York City. One such vehicle was built by Mack Trucks Incorporated in 1900. It had a seating capacity of 20 with a 4-cylinder gas engine developing 40 horsepower, and it could travel at 20 miles per hour. 1898, the British Motor Company, Daimler, had a hand in popularizing internal combustion engine buses. Their double-decker buses could carry 20 passengers and travel 11 miles an hour. So Daimler was mass-producing and selling to other countries. Now, until about the 1920s, the technical history of the modern bus was intertwined with that of the truck, because the early bus consisted of a bus body mounted on a truck chassis. And interestingly, the majority of school buses to this day are made that way. And in 1921, the first vehicle with a chassis specifically designed for bus service was made in the United States by the Fagel Safety Coach Company of Oakland, California. The widened and lengthened frame was 12 inches lower than a truck, and in 1926, Fagel developed the first. Other early bus manufacturers were Mack and Yellow Truck and Coach in the United States, both of which built gasoline-electric models. In these buses, a gasoline engine drove a direct current generator, and the output of the generator provided the electrical power for the driving motors on the rear wheels. And interestingly, unlike its earlier predecessors, bus services took quite a while to catch on. The first transcontinental bus service was not implemented until 1928, and even then it was relatively slow to catch on. Although intercity bus travel had climbed from almost nothing to over 7 billion passenger miles in 1929, it was always the choice of a relatively small number of people. Following modest growth during the 1930s, ridership soared during World War II, peaking just above 27 billion passenger miles and attaining its highest ever share of the market. The federal government was also, pardon the pun, on board with buses early on. Starting in 1925, a series of 40 bills calling for the regulation of motor passenger carriers came before Congress. Congressional hearings and 2 major investigations by the ICC, that's the Interstate Commerce Commission of the motor transport industry, in 1928 and 1932 made other suggestions for legislation, as did the Federal Coordinator of Transportation. But legislators felt under pressure from varied interest groups and were uncertain how to proceed. This led to the Motor Carrier Act of 1935, which entitled existing carriers to receive operating permits on filing applications and granted certificates to others firmly after an investigation of hearing which established that their businesses were in public interest. Certificates could be suspended, changed, or revoked. All interstate bus operators now had to conform to regulations governing safety, finance, insurance, accounting, and records, and they were required to consult the government over any rate changes. And under the new regulations of the MCA, competition between long-distance carriers was limited. Existing companies who had filed for permits protested against applications from new competitors on their routes. If it was established that services were adequate and traffic was light, new applications were often turned down. And interestingly, the Depression saw new improvements in buses. In 1931, the first rear engine in an integral frame bus was introduced, and 2-stroke diesel engines were first used in buses in 1938, and to this day are still found in most city and intercity models. And as you can probably imagine, World War II saw a great increase in bus travel. As you can imagine, with gas rations, people found it would be easier and perhaps cheaper to travel on a bus rather than use your own car. The need to carry both civilians and troops, combined with gasoline and rubber and part shortages, forced Americans to move from their automobiles onto public transportation. New records were set for passenger transportation. Seats were filled to capacity with standing room only. Long-distance bus passenger miles doubled from 13.6 billion in 1941 to 26.9 billion in 1945. Following the wartime conditions, bus managers thought that they could build on their increased businesses, provided that they could both invest in new vehicles and buildings and could persuade Americans that buses offered many advantages over automobiles for long-distance travel. But they had not reckoned on either post-war inflation or a lengthy federal government inquiry into conduct of their industry. However, this did not stop many cities from developing their own bus lines. And again, we saw another development in buses. 1951, Mercedes-Benz designed and built a bus model with a rear engine and a spacious body. Over time, several specialized type of buses were formed: city transit, suburban, intercity, and school. And by this time, such cities as Cleveland, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania had developed their own extensive bus networks, which replaced the older streetcar systems and adapted to growing commuter demands. They utilized different constructions to serve their specific purposes better. However, this era began to see mass transit on the decline. Car-centric culture began to emerge during the 1950s, and it became commonplace for households to own at least one car. There was a slight pushback during the 60s and 70s with some environmental concerns, but the cars won. However, there is still a need for public transit, especially in larger cities, where parking is limited and owning a car is not always possible. And public transportation offers another way to get around. And with that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to end the podcast now, but I hope you've enjoyed this ride with me. And I think we've learned that if something loses traction during one era, it can easily gain traction the next. Bus lines may have begun to look somewhat bleak during the 1960s, but they are still around today to feed the needs of people who can't afford cars or just don't want to drive. So with that, I now say goodbye and God bless.